We're really happy to have Lisa Strahov here to talk. Like I said, we originally had her lecture scheduled for over a year ago in March. I think it was March. Was it March or April? I have one of the two. It was all a blur. When we were supposed to have First Impressions open. And now that First Impressions actually is open, she agreed to do this virtually. So Lisa is assistant professor of English at Marquette University. And she did her graduate work in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research concerns late medieval reception of Chaucer and his contemporaries, Anglo-French literary and cultural relations during the Hundred Years' War, and the history of late medieval manuscripts, with a special focus on anthologies of medieval lyric. So as you can imagine, this last part is why we figured she'd be a great speaker to talk about early printed books. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa and we'll get started.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yes, especially since it was late April of last year that this talk was supposed to happen. So I'm just very glad to be able to do it at long last. And I'm going to start, I have a sort of epic PowerPoint for you all, and I'm going to share my screen and fingers crossed that it all plays. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? If somebody could nod, good. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So what I wanted to talk about today was that we think of the printing press as this stunning revolution, the quickening of a deeply time-consuming and laborious process. Medieval manuscript production involves people using sharpened goose feathers known as quills that actually have to be resharpened every few letters in order to make these individual letters laboriously on the page, add all the decoration, producing stunning results. But of course, just what a deeply, incredibly time-consuming process. So with that sort of background, the idea of Gutenberg's letterpress just seems like an absolutely extraordinary innovation in all sorts of ways. Johannes Gutenberg in the 1440s and early 50s, drawing on the existing model of wine and olive presses, comes up with a new way of essentially bringing a weight down onto paper that is laid over individual pieces of type in order to produce an impression of that type onto the paper and to print pages over and over and over again all at once instead of having to laboriously do them by hand. And type, which is also arguably his even most innovative invention, is essentially a carved piece of metal carved into a specific shape of a letter or piece of punctuation. A mold is then created and new metal, molten metal alloys are poured into the mold to produce ever increasing quantities of A's, B's, C's, etc. And type was held in a 2-letter case, which is a word for box. We had the small type in cases on the bottom and the capital letters of type in cases up at the top, which is why we still call them lowercase and uppercase letters today in reflection of this old practice. And the compositor would hold a composing stick. And importantly, the compositor is the person who loads the type onto the stick and ultimately into the tray that will hold the type that will create the book. This compositor is working entirely backwards because of how the paper comes down onto the type in order to produce the correct impression. The letters and the spaces between them and the punctuation, all of that has to be backwards. And the compositor is loading the type onto the stick that is held together by these clamps, and he's building a few lines of text at a time and placing them into this amazing object. What we see here is actually 4 pages of arranged type, arranged exactly as the typographer wants it. They are divided by an iron frame, and wooden wedges are placed to lock that type in place to the desired size of the text block in order to produce what is known as a printer's form. So I'm going to turn to this wonderful image of a wonderful image of an early modern print shop. The image itself comes from a little bit later, but it gives you a really accurate representation of what an early modern print shop looks like. Outlined in red in the background, we have a gentleman who seems to be doing something with a candle, and that is an ink maker who is making ink out of lamp soot. Soot from candles was one of the principal ingredients in this glossy jet black ink that was vital for its durability and for its ability to produce really sharp images on the page. Outlined in blue, we see the compositor standing in front of a case. Notice, of course, that all of the images people in this image are men, because men were in fact the people who did all of this work, although women were employed in folding the pages and sewing them together, because of the folding and sewing was sort of aligned with the idea of women's work in this period, kind of like garment work, etc., coming out of the tradition of women being seamstresses in the period. But men were doing all of the quote unquote difficult work of composing and actually printing. So we see our male compositor standing with a little stick in his hand, pulling the type out of its individual compartments to build the page. And I'm going to zoom in on the image on the other side so that you can really see what a Gutenberg press looked like. So we have two people working the press. One of them has these leather balls that are stuffed with wool or horsehair, and they're covered in ink, and he's essentially kind of basting the prepared form with ink, getting it all evenly covered. And then we have a second person who's loading, well, in this case, he's taking a piece of paper out, but the second person is loading a dampened piece of paper into the tympan, which is a frame. And the tympan, the frisket is a different hinged frame that folds over the tympan, and then the frisket and the tympan are folded over the form, kind of like an accordion. This ensures that the dampened piece of paper doesn't move at all during this process. The form with the tympan and the frisket and the paper locked between them is then wound on the carriage into the press itself, and where you see this heavy plate called a platen, and it's the action of the plate slamming down onto the frisket, tympan, paper, and form that is going to make the black ink on the type impress itself onto the paper. And it really does actually impress itself. You can see in early printed books that there's actual indentations of the letters in the thick paper. The platen operated by means of a screw, which was Gutenberg's borrowing from both oil and wine presses. It was the screw technology of bringing a heavy object down by pulling a bar that was so important to his development of the printing press. And then the carriage, after all this happened, was wheeled out, and then the printed sheet of paper was pulled out and a new sheet of paper was placed, and the whole process was started all over again. Working at top speed, book historians have estimated that working at top speed, two people could make 2,500 pages a day in theory. Emphasis on in theory, because rarely would anybody actually accomplish this. Firstly, because there would be a lot of stopping and starting, right? Because, you have to re-ink the pages, you have to make sure everything is arranged in order, that you haven't screwed anything up, that everything is fixed in place. And also because there's actually a really great article about this by somebody, a very famous book historian, D.F. Mackenzie, who points out that humans are not machines. And so any theoretical arguments about 2,500 pages a day need to be matched by the realities of work breaks, bathroom breaks, drink breaks, etc., and that human beings cannot operate actually at these speeds. So we must revise all of our assumptions. That said, of course, absolutely, what an invention, what a remarkable invention, if you consider the methodical slowness of creating manuscripts. That said, as inventive as the printing press is, it is nevertheless, in terms of the visual quality of the products that are created, You still have medieval manuscripts serving as the fundamental paradigm for what a book looks like. On the left side of the screen, we have an image from the Gutenberg Bible in the 1450s. The type that Gutenberg created, his greatest invention, which was the creation of movable type, you might notice looks an awful lot like the image on the other side, which is in fact a manuscript. Gutenberg's type is known as blackletter. And what it actually is a complete and perfect reproduction of an existing script known as Gothic script. I'm going to take a second to emphasize vocabulary differences here. We do not call what Gutenberg has on his page a font, because that is a term from computers. We call it type. And if we're talking about a handwritten manuscript, we call it script, despite how similar these things might look. So if we look at this page, you can find this in the wonderful Milwaukee Art Museum exhibit, First Impressions, which, by the way, is a great title for that exhibit. I love it. The First Impressions exhibit contains this wonderful object, and I thank the Milwaukee Art Museum for letting me use images from photographs from the exhibit in my talk. So this is a very typical example of an early printed page. We note the hand-drawn and colored initials. We note the use of red on this page, and we note the particular type. And I'm going to go through all of these in order to explain where these particular visual elements come from. They are not invented by early printers. Instead, as you can see in this example from a late 15th century, nearly contemporary British Library manuscript, the use of red lines, this is known as rubrication, is extremely common in medieval manuscripts in order to sort of govern and organize the reading experience, to draw the reader's attention to specific places. And if you've ever heard the expression, a red letter day, what a wonderful red letter day, that has to do with medieval calendars that used red ink to mark out important feast days in the Christian tradition and Sundays and various other important days of the year to draw the reader's eye to the specialness of that day. So we still kind of use that term today. We note also that the initials in the manuscript and in the early printed page look very, very similar. They're still being hand drawn in this period. And if we look at the type that is used by Tilman Carver in his Book of Hours, we notice its remarkable visual similarity to the letters on the other side of the page, which come from a nearly contemporary manuscript. This is a manuscript, a beautiful manuscript, executed in something called Humanistic Script. And I'm just going to go back a couple of slides to remind you of both blackletter and Gothic textura. These are spiky, very thick, very black, very pointed sort of scripts and type that are frankly quite difficult to read. Easy for me because I've been reading them for a very long time now, but in general, rather sort of complicated and still visually associated by us with the Middle Ages. Whereas this script and this type are so much more legible, right? Round, clear, like very easy to read. So this script in manuscripts was associated with humanism. Contrary to popular opinion, humanism is not actually an invention of the Renaissance either. It emerges already in the 14th and early 15th centuries in France and Italy, from where it spreads ever outward. And I apologize if you hear my very neurotic dog barking in the background, which she does a lot. I had to be at home because, strangely, the Wi-Fi in my office is somehow worse than the Wi-Fi in my house, which means that we must contend with my dog. So I apologize if her barking is disruptive. But Humanistic Script itself has a really interesting and storied ideologically based history. It developed from a combination of older scripts that have a direct or imagined connection to Rome. The capital letters, the initials of Humanistic Script, derive from Rustic Capitals, which might look familiar to you if you've been to any downtown of any city anywhere, especially DC or any major city, these are the same capitals we still see on the sides of our governmental buildings, because these were the script used on walls of temples in Rome that proclaimed the majesty of Rome. And that enduring association of this particular type of letter with the Roman Empire continues to this day. And under Charlemagne, Charlemagne's empire, which imagined itself as a newly Christianized continuation of the great Roman Empire, Charlemagne developed something called, or under Charlemagne was developed something called Carolingian minuscule. And if you've ever wondered why the Carolingian Empire has anything to do with Charlemagne, it's because Charlemagne is French for Charles the Great, which in Latin is Carolus Magnus. So Carolingian is the Latin adjective for Charles. And in Charlemagne's empire, the idea of Charlemagne wanted a visual standardization of script. He wanted monasteries to promote learning that would visually signify the weight and majesty and size of his empire. So he encouraged the standardization of a particular kind of new script that was very easy and legible to read, which was ideologically associated in this period, again, with this memory of Rome. So the memory of Carolingian minuscule and rustic capitals come together in the 15th century to produce this new, much clearer, much brighter, sort of bigger script called Humanistic Script. And Humanistic Script, in turn, gets turned into a type known as Roman type, continuing that association of the script with the memory of ancient Rome. And if it looks familiar to you today, it's because that association remains ever present, because Times New Roman is called Times New Roman, because it is the font derived from Roman type, which is derived from Humanistic Script, which is derived from Carolingian minuscule and rustic capitals, because ultimately all roads lead to Rome, and everything that is old is new again, and everything that is new is old again. So for all of its, the point of my introduction is to suggest that for all of its revolutionary nature, print is still very much deeply dependent on earlier manuscript production, and that divide between manuscript and print is actually very, very fuzzy. So for the remainder of my talk, I wanted to address three things. Firstly, I wanted to emphasize the invention of paper and print technology, without which Gutenberg's press would not be possible, not in the West, but in China, and the very slow adoption of paper and print technologies in the West. I then wanted to emphasize the slow pace of change from manuscript to print in a world for which manuscripts remain the textual default for what makes a book a book. Manuscripts are the paradigm. Early printers are innovators in the paradigm, but they're not transforming it. And I wanted to conclude with an example that has us thinking about a tradition known as the Dance Macabre, a tantalizing wisp of which you get in the strange background to this slide, which I will explain later. If you're seeing a skeleton, you're not imagining it. I will explain what the Dance Macabre tradition is. It is a fascinating example of a tradition that is hyper aware of the combinatory power of visual and literary culture, and that combinatory power gets registered on either side of the manuscript print divide in fascinating ways. And it allows us to consider the interstitial space occupied by early printers who are simultaneously working with entrenched hegemonic models and fundamental medieval paradigms for what makes a book, but are also thinking about the invention of new visual economies of book production. So let's go way back in time and to a very different place from Gutenberg and think about the invention of paper. Like all innovations in reading and writing, just as the Gutenberg press is a development of the wine and olive press, so too the origin of paper is an adaptive technology, going as far back as the 2nd or 1st century BCE, perfected by the 2nd century CE. The Chinese had always, for centuries, traditionally made felt out of beating rags into a pulp to separate the fibers and then soaking them in water. They also had a plant known now as the paper mulberry, which was also beaten to soften its fibers, which would then make it stick together into a cloth-like substance, and clothing was made out of it. So paper is essentially an adaptation of both of these ideas. And I have a wonderful illustration of this. This is a beautiful little album of images from the 18th century by a Jesuit priest who traveled to China and encountered a community that traditionally made paper from bamboo. And he had commissioned drawings of the entire process and then sent this booklet back to Paris for the edification of other people. It's a really beautiful little delicate object, and it actually has about almost 30 images detailing the process. But I just picked out a couple of the key ones to show you how paper is made. So we see here people gathering bamboo. Paper was made out of a variety of different kinds of plants, bamboo being one of them. And then the bamboo is stripped of its hard outer layer to get at the soft, sort of fibrous layer in the middle of it. That then is chopped up into small pieces. It's cooked in a vat of heated water to turn it into a mush or a pulp, a kind of soup. And then that is placed in these big rectangular troughs, and the bamboo mush is scooped onto a screen mold, which is literally a kind of rectangular sieve that creates a thin film of this mush on top of the sieve that then gets carefully peeled away and hung up to dry. And in the process of drying in the sun, it hardens into the substance we call paper. And the spread of paper to Western Europe is actually quite slow. From the 3rd to 7th century, paper slowly moves westward through Central Asia, eventually reaching the Middle East. We have, in the mid-8th century, we see paper manufacture in Samarkand, which is in present-day Uzbekistan, and then in Baghdad, in present-day Iraq, in 794. It comes to Africa in the 9th century, and by the 10th century, Fez in Morocco becomes one of the centers of papermaking. And of course, what's just north of Fez? North of Fez is Spain through the Strait of Gibraltar. So via the Islamic conquest of Spain, paper comes to Europe in the 10th century, but it stops in the Iberian Peninsula because of tensions between Islamic and Catholic Spain. So kind of this, it remains within its Iberian corner. But in the 12th century, Italy develops a paper through its connection to the Byzantine Empire on the one hand, and its Arabic-speaking communities that live in Sicily. The first paper mill established in Italy in 1268 still exists today. You can go visit it in Fabriano, which is really remarkable. The first paper mill is in Nuremberg by 1390. And England is a fascinatingly late adoptee of paper. It only really sees paper in the early to mid-15th century, which raises the fascinating question of why does it take so long for such an obviously easier substance than parchment to make it to England? Parchment is made by skinning animals, stripping them of their fat and their veins, curing those skins in lime, stretching them out in the sun laboriously over multiple weeks to get them thinner and thinner, dyeing them. Like it's a mess. So the question is, why would paper not just immediately supplant this process? There's a couple answers to that question. Firstly, England in particular has a lot of animals. They do not have a supply-demand problem with parchment. They have so many sheep, pigs, and goats, and when those animals get old, they turn them into parchment, and it's sort of a very easy, intuitive process for them. But paper does ultimately come to England, which is, as I said, one of the last adoptees, because finally demand does outstrip supply. It takes a very long time for that to happen in parts of Europe. But firstly, because the expansion of trade in Europe leads to a giant expansion of the merchant class. And whenever you have a growth of the middle class, you have a growth of entertainment. And that means that literacy spreads across all strata of the middle class Before, in the Middle Ages, it was the aristocrats who knew how to read, and by the even by the beginning of the 15th century, literacy is spreading much deeper through urban communities. And on the other hand, if you have expanded trade and an expanded merchant class, guess what you also have? Bureaucracy. Because you can't have trade without bureaucracy, without tariffs, and without import and export and taxes and records of what's going where. And so you finally, for the first time in the 15th century, finally have a situation where you actually need a cheaper and more efficient source for your records than parchment. But it does take a while. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, again, jumping back in time, is the emergence of print, which is not an invention of Gutenberg. Woodblock printing, as you probably know, develops out of relief seal carving and stamping processes in the 8th or 9th century in China. But it's very different from printing in the West. Instead of individual pieces, which I'll get to in a second, Chinese woodblock printing has the entire page. The entire page is carved onto a single piece of wood. So you see another example of this up at the top here. Everything but the Chinese character is cut away, leaving the character in relief. That is inked. You place a dampened piece of paper with like a heavy weight over that, and that leaves an impression on the paper. You pull the paper away, and you end up with a printed image on the other side. Movable type, the image here is of wood, but actually earthenware movable type was the first kind of type. There we go. That was developed already in the middle of the 11th century. But Chinese characters, for anyone who's studied Chinese in this audience, as you might know, Chinese characters are plentiful. There are pictograms and ideograms, and there are syllables and individual letters all represented with an enormous variety of deeply complex images. It is unrealistic to ask a compositor to stand at it would have to be a wall-sized case in order to get all of the individual pieces of type. Oddly enough, it's actually easier to just print an entire page on wood and print the whole page and then carve another piece of wood for the next page and the next page and the next page. It seems more laborious, but given the realities of Chinese characters, it's actually a significantly easier process. And so the wood blocks were not destroyed, they were kept, and they were reused over and over and over again. And so this is a really good reminder that what we think of as revolutionary and sort of natural and organic, movable type, so much less laborious than making an entire page, whether on a piece of parchment or on a piece of wood, is not revolutionary everywhere, given the realities of languages in different parts of the world. And in fact, Chinese woodblock printing, for all of its seeming inefficiencies, produces a completely different print culture than the one in the West. In the West, after the introduction of Gutenberg's press, we see, it's extremely expensive. There's a lot of labor involved. You need somebody to cast the type. You need somebody to build these machines. You need somebody to operate these machines. The apparatus and the economic burden that comes with that apparatus is enormous. In China, to produce print, all you need is wood, carving instruments, paper, and ink. Those are the only things that you need. And this means that woodblock printing continues through the 19th century in China, and it spreads to every single part of the Chinese empire. It is in the tiniest village with 300 people has a carver, 200 people, 100 people has a carver that is making woodblock printing. This means that literacy rates are 99% of the population already by the 16th century. This means that there is books and print production happening in all corners of China, very different from the situation in Europe, where print is really concentrated inside urban areas in particular parts even of Western Europe. And so you have this actual incredible universality and access to education, which arguably some Chinese book historians think is responsible for the sort of the immense importance placed on education, schooling, the university, and the exam system in China that continues to this day. So just a reminder that technologies of efficiency can look very differently in very different places. So what's particularly interesting, this is kind of a mystery in book history. In Germany and Austria, you get block books emerging contemporaneously with Gutenberg's press. A block book, they were mostly restricted to Bibles. A block book is the same thing that I just described in China, but for a European context. They are books where every single page is made out of one single piece of wood, and then the next page is made from the next piece of wood, the next, et cetera, et cetera. So there's disagreement still if this is a parallel simplification of Gutenberg technology to make print a little bit more accessible to people who didn't have the economic, cities that didn't have the economic backbone to set up a print shop. Or, in particular, Chinese book historians believe that this is very possibly a product of Mongol-European contact. Mongol armies reached Eastern Germany by the 13th century, which would make block books a direct import of Chinese woodblock printing. And that, in turn, makes it possible that Gutenberg was actually partially also inspired by woodblock printing, these block books, to create his printing press. So already the history of paper and print in the West reminds us of the deep complexity of any technological revolution, right? This is a slow process moving east to west that is continually building on existing inventions and revising already existing processes. So we saw earlier the incredible similarity between printed books of ours and existing manuscripts. But there's also the broader matter here of the way early printers understand and execute page layout, and the way in which that understanding and execution continues to be deeply indebted to the work of earlier manuscript production. So here we have a stunning example of layout also found in the exhibit in the Milwaukee Art Museum. Well, like, what a stunning example of print layout. Imagine somebody putting this page together entirely by hand and backwards with all of these beautiful borders. What an innovative use of page layout this seems to be. And it's exactly like a contemporary medieval manuscript, also of a legal codex that, as you can see, has that main text in the center and a smaller text on the side. This is a very old manuscript tradition going back centuries of having a main text, originally the Bible, and then other kinds of important texts that require explanation, educational text, didactic text, legal text, etc., with the commentary arranged on the sides. We also see in that same image of this civil law codex printed by Andrea Torresani, we also see a little P placed by the printer to tell the illustrator to draw a big, nice, beautiful P in its place. This is directly borrowed from medieval manuscript production. These are known as guide letters that scribes would leave for illustrators in order to come back and know what letter was supposed to be there without having to think too much about like reading the text so that they could work more efficiently. So efficiencies from the medieval world continue to play a role in the efficiencies of the printing world. And finally, here we eventually, in a new efficiency, we have a displacement of initials, hand-drawn initials by woodcut initials, as you can see here. But even this beautiful image comes to us ultimately from medieval manuscript models, specifically the Italian white vine initial that is very characteristic of 15th century Italian humanist manuscripts, the same ones that give us the base for Roman type. So what I want to emphasize in this section is that for early printers, the book is still an existing medieval artifact that can be made more efficiently rather than a brand new post-medieval artifact. And I think that's very important for us to remember because we place so much popular cultural emphasis on the glorious Renaissance with its revolutionary rebirth, its transformation of everything that came before it. Gone are the Dark Ages, ages. Gone are the dark ages. Hello, brand new shining beacon of light from classical antiquity, leaping over the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. But of course, the reality is so much fuzzier than we like to think that it is. There are no actual sharp demarcations between historical periods. They bleed into one another. In fact, arguably, early print could even be seen as a step back. I had to include a couple images of these incredible late 15th century, so contemporaneous with Gutenberg. We see this incredible manuscript production reaches a lofty, almost unimaginable heights. These are Black Books of Hours. There are 7 of them left in existence. They're made by coating vellum in an iron copper solution to dye it jet black. And then the script and illustration is done with a combination of silver and gold pigments. As you can imagine, iron, copper, silver, everything corrodes very easily. So very few of these remain to us. And I had to include another image of just a stunning example. And just to sort of emphasize to you what 15th century manuscript production looked like by the time that Gutenberg came around. And this is the Coburger Bible, printed in 1483. Contemporaneously with the production of these manuscripts, it's got a kind of clumsy woodcut. It's kind of clumsily washed over. I mean, it's a little messy. We've got little drips and drabs of ink on the bottom of the page. Like, early printers are still very much figuring stuff out when manuscript production has ultimately reached a kind of Baroque height, right? And in fact, this situation continues. In the 17th century, we have it's very common through the centuries of print until the 19th century to have a massive amount of reuse of materials, sometimes in remarkable ways. So these 17th century English popular ballads, as you can see, are printed with the exact same rather intense woodblock, one of which stands as the illustration to the Ranting Whore's Resolution, a deeply misogynistic broadside ballad about, a loose woman. And the other one is about the mourning conquest, that is in fact lamenting a woman who has been led astray by a rogue and whose virtue and reputation have been forever tarnished. Same woodcut, 2 very, very different subjects. In fact, even in the 18th century, print was still such a mess that in the wonderful Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which if you've never read, I highly encourage you to read because it is one of the funniest things I've ever read, Franklin really wants to bring more print to the colonies. His brother is a printer, and he travels to Britain to learn the ways of the printing press. And he's really excited to learn from the best of the best about how to make good print, because print in the colonies during this time is in a terrible state of disarray. And I have to read the whole quote because it's hilarious. And this is what he finds in London. At my first admission into this printing house, I took to working at press, imagining I felt a want of the bodily exercise I'd been used to in America, where press work is mixed with composing. I drank only water. The other workmen, nearly 50 in number, were great guzzlers of beer. On occasion, I carried up and down stairs a large form of types in each hand. That's that big tray containing all the composed pages that we talked about earlier, when others carried but one in both hands. They wondered to see from this and several instances that the water American, as they called me, was stronger than themselves, who drank strong beer. We had an alehouse boy who attended always in the house to supply the workmen. My companion at press drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast with his bread and cheese, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner, a pint in the afternoon about 6 o'clock, and another when he'd done his day's work. I thought it a detestable custom, but it was necessary, he supposed, to drink strong beer, that he might be strong to labor. I'm sure you can imagine what horrific work these printers produced, having consumed beer every hour of every day. And there's a hilarious continuation of this episode where Franklin, with great difficulty but eventual success, and he's very proud of himself, convinces them that things like oatmeal will be like much better for their stomachs in the morning. And they'll like, if they just eat some protein, they'll feel stronger. And he like weans all of them off of alcohol and replaces like their beer with pulses, which is very, very funny. Benjamin Franklin, you must remember, is also a very, very confirmed vegetarian, sort of remarkably for his period. So I'm reaching the end of what I wanted to say, and I have for you this marvelous image from Hans Holbein from his Dance Macabre woodcuts. I wanted to end this talk on the idea that early print, in taking from the Middle Ages, also excitingly and dramatically reshapes earlier conventions into productive new visual forms, a concept that is particularly well illustrated by the fascinating Dance Macabre tradition. The Dance Macabre tradition is a complex of texts and images that foreground this implacability of death. Death comes for all members of society, as we especially know now in 2021, from the Pope to the newborn child. And this tradition took two different forms. It was painted as city murals, where you have images of skeletons representing death, leading different members of society, recognizable by their distinctive clothing, to their ultimate end. And poetry, in which the serialization of images is replaced by the serialization of stanzas, in which death talks to the Pope, and then the emperor, and then the king, and then the duke, and then the knight, and onward until it gets to the child in its cradle. And these sometimes, especially in the earliest case of the Dance Macabre, the earliest known instantiation of the Dance Macabre was a poem composed in the early 1420s, of which I've given you an excerpt. But this poem was actually available to viewers, and I say viewers, not readers, as a mural, which had this kind of imagery of skeletons leading different members of society, and beneath it was written the text of the poem, matched up to all the different images. And these murals are really striking and important, because if you think about it, they're made life-size so that they can be seen from a distance. But the idea, and we have paintings that show us people doing this, the idea is that you walk along the mural, read it, looking at the pictures and reading the text underneath. And the mural is of death, leading people to their death, walking along to the ultimate end. So you, as the viewer, do that walk yourself, thinking, therefore, like having this embodied experience of what the mural and the poem is telling you death is like. Very, very sort of striking way of medieval sort of way of making people think and ruminate on death by actually kind of living out the experience of it. And it was so striking that one such viewer, John Lydgate, decides to translate the French Dance Macabre into English, into something called the Dance of Death. And in his prologue, he recounts this very experience of seeing that mural of the Dance Macabre in downtown Paris. I'll read it in Middle English, but you've got it in the modern next to you. Consider this je focus that ben wies, and it imprinteth in your memoriala, like the example which that at Paris, I found depicted honest in a wala. Full notably, as ihre Herr Sechal, there are French clerks taking acquaintance, et token me to translate alla out of the French macabre's dance. And I want to draw your attention to the amazing slippage in this stanza. Consider this, consider death, imprint the idea of death in your memory, like the mural that I saw in Paris, that I am going to translate for you into text. So I saw a mural, the image of it is, this vivid image of it is so sharply imprinted, right, printed in my mind, that I, just like the impression of the type against the paper, is imprinted in the blank slate of my mind. And I'm going to offer you this image purely in text. So because Lydgate's Dance of Death does not actually, none of the manuscripts of it contain any accompanying illustrations, but we know from historical records that his text was ultimately also transformed into a city mural that was placed on the cloisters in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. So we have this, as you can see, a very interesting visual literary tradition. So the question is, what did early printers do with it? The Dance Macabre was super popular, and it was printed already in 1485 by somebody named Guillaume Marchand, which is very early for any work. And notice what he does with it in his first edition. He's chosen black letter type, which visually evokes the Middle Ages, and he's placed woodcuts of the figures, the death with all of its different people, bringing them to death's dance. And notice that the pictures, the images are themselves encased in arches and colonnades. So what he's doing is the original Dance Macabre mural, as well as Lydgate's Dance of Death and other murals, were often painted on the walls of cloisters and churches. So he's giving you a handheld version of Lydgate's experience. This is what the mural looked like. And he has translated the image of this mural, keeping the original script in which it was probably painted, right? Gothic script, the popular script of the 15th century, but he's giving it to you as this handheld object so that you can have Lydgate's experience, but you can take it out and have that experience without going to Paris every single time you want to read the text. And yet you're still kind of conceptually in this cloistered space as evoked by the decoration of his woodcuts. And I want to end with just one more example of this, a very different take on the same idea in a slightly later early printed edition. This is Philippe Piguet's Book of Hours. And it is made in 1497, so a little bit later. And a book of hours is a daily book of prayer that you would have on hand in order to read from throughout the day. And it always contains a section for prayers for the dead, so that you can ruminate and meditate and pray for the souls of your dearly departed. And here what the text on this page is prayers for the dead. But on the side, around the page, we have these woodblock borders that are the Dance Macabre. And we know that it's the Dance Macabre text because the order of the images exactly follows the order of the stanzas of extant texts of the Dance Macabre. So this is yet another printer's, a completely different conceptual take on this tradition, where he's also thinking, how would you hold the idea of death in your memory? I know. We're going to have it be the border of these texts of prayers so that you do the prayers, but the images hover sort of around the corners of your mind and impress themselves upon your mind by being the borders of the prayers that you're reading. So this final example just continues to remind us about how printers work with existing paradigms and existing technologies while bringing new technologies to them and thinking about the new possibility that those technologies can afford us. And so this final example reminds us of the deep connections between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance through the influence of manuscript on print, and reminds us of how the Renaissance is using its new tools to excitingly and elaborately reconfigure the medieval past into new futures. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if any, let's see, we don't have any questions. I don't know if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. We've gotten an excellent lecture. Thank you.
I did run through a lot in 45 minutes, admittedly.
Sometimes those are the best lectures though, you know, so if you don't like this topic, you're moving on to something else.
I have a question. I apologize for my video quality. I also have a neurotic dog. So I'm in a different room that is not ideal. But with your last example, you were talking about how printed books looked to manuscripts as a way of reimagining those manuscripts for the future. And I was wondering if there are any examples of manuscript producers trying to differentiate manuscripts from printed books in order to maintain their superior quality in the face of a new technology. So I'm thinking about the way that printmakers started to create deluxe editions and limited editions as photography became more prevalent.
Oh gosh, that is a really such a really great question. That is sort of a burgeoning area actually of early print, of late manuscript and early print studies that I don't know as much about as I would like, but we definitely do have examples we definitely have some examples of very late 15th century medieval manuscripts that are trying to get the precision of their letters so perfect that it would become deeply difficult to even distinguish a manuscript from a printed edition. We definitely absolutely have a sort of impulse to regularize script to such an extent to bring that handwritten quality of manuscripts to such heights that it would be indistinguishable from this much more automated process. And I know this because at the Rare Book School, we were given a test at one point where we had to figure out which was the manuscript printed on paper and, which was the manuscript made on paper and which was the printed book. And we did very well, our whole class, for like 5 examples. And the last 3 broke us. They were very late 15th century and early 16th century manuscripts that truly were indistinguishable from printed editions. And what's also really interesting, and people are starting to look more into this, is also we think that print would supplant manuscripts for audiences, but we in fact have an enormous amount of early 16th century manuscripts that are copies of early printed books, because some people really still wanted to have the handcrafted experience. Like they had the book was available as an edition, but they actually wanted somebody to recopy that edition into a manuscript for their own use, because that was still more luxurious and more special to them. So it's a really interesting area of study. It's much more complicated than we think.
Thank you so much.
So we've had a few more congratulations. Fabulous passion for the subject. Very thorough and understandable. Thank you. I have to say, you know, I'm a knitter, Lisa, and your comment about trying to make something handmade look like it was printed reminds me of how some people try to make hand-knitted things look machine-made, and when I make a mistake in my knitting, I have to remind myself it's handmade. So of course, you know, it actually adds to the charm. It's not detracting from it. So you see that a lot in
Absolutely, it's rustic.
Right, exactly.
Call it rustic, and then it's great.
Yeah, exactly.
This is why I make galettes and not pies, yes. Because with a galette, the whole point is that it looks clumsy, and then it's very charming looking, right, as opposed to a pie, which is supposed to look perfect.
Precisely. All right. Any last questions? We're almost to the end of our time, so. But yeah, this has been fabulous, Lisa. I now I want to do another printed book project so that we can have you come back and lecture on something else. Would be lots of fun. So
anytime. Okay, always good. A pleasure. I should explain the reason. My passion for this subject also comes aside from the fact that I work with manuscripts. I also teach book history to students, and so right now, actually, you caught me. This worked out very nicely. This rescheduled lecture, because you caught me in the middle of a semester where I'm actually running a book history class with a bunch of seniors, where they get to do projects on books in our special collections at Marquette. And so all of this, we just covered the transition from manuscript to print. So all of this is very fresh in my mind.
Excellent. Good. I'm so glad. Yeah. Marquette has an amazing special collections.
Specifically, they're a collection of incunabula, right? Yeah, they have this really rich collection there.
Yeah. I got to go over and look at some of them when I first started working on the project, and it didn't end up being big enough to get any loans, but they said, anytime you want to borrow something, let us know, because they've got an amazing collection there.
Yeah, and it continues to be built up. So that Book of Hours that Piguet that was in my last slide, that is an acquisition from just right before the pandemic. So what's really exciting is that there is money to continue enlarging this collection. And there's Amy Carey at Raynor Library has a really good relationship with an incunabula are books that are printed before 1500. It stands for cradle or swaddling clothes, because that era from 1450 to 1500 is the birth of print. So the books are little babies, which is definitely how I think of them. And Amy has this really amazing relationship with a incunabulum dealer who just, I don't know how he does it. He just gets her stuff from all over the country. It's very impressive.
Yeah, it is really impressive, because, you know, there are collectors that's what they want. And so there's only so many to go around. So it's pretty amazing that they can still add to their collection there. So
we have some stuff there that there's only like 8 or 9 copies in the entire world, and one of them is at Raynor. It's really remarkable.
That is fabulous. Excellent. Good. All right. Well, I think that we're done then. So thanks again, Lisa. And, you know, for anybody who hasn't gone to see the show, go, and maybe you'll run into her in the gallery. So
yes, it's an amazing collection of materials. I really, really recommend it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.